All right, guys, we have more information on intermittent fasting and the microbiome. We're going to talk about all that today and so much more on today's episode of Short Stories of Bacteria. Hey, everybody. Welcome back to another episode of Short Stories of Bacteria. I, as always, am your host, Dr. K, and I'm here to guide you through yet another story chronicling the lives of the tiny and infamous, and that, of course, is the incredible and amazing bacteria. Welcome back, everybody, to another episode of the podcast. I have a really cool story talking about intermittent fasting, talking about different kinds of diets, and how intermittent fasting may be a little bit more beneficial than some of these other diets, in part due to this microbiome. But we're going to jump into that in 2 seconds, but first, don't forget to hit that like, share, subscribe button if you are listening to this on YouTube. If you're listening to this on Spotify or Apple Podcasts or any of the other podcast mediums, don't forget to hit that follow button. That helps the channel go. It helps the podcast keep going, and I really, really appreciate it. But enough of that nonsense. Let us jump into this scientific information for the day. So I mentioned earlier at the top of the episode that this is going to have to do with intermittent fasting. So it's important, I think, to define intermittent fasting again. We had an episode a couple of months ago about intermittent fasting, but it's worth it to go over it again. So intermittent fasting is exactly what it sounds like. You're fasting intermittently. You're eating at specific times, and then the rest of the time you're just fasting, right? And then usually that fasting period is longer than your eating period. Now, there's a whole bunch of different ways that you can put intermittent fasting into effect. The way that I like to do it, the easiest for me to implement, is time-restricted eating. So every single day, or at least most days, every single day in theory, you get to eat for a certain period of the day. And so that's like a 4-hour window or a 6-hour window or an 8-hour window, even a 12-hour window. And then you just simply fast for the rest of the day, right? So you can eat during a window and then you stop eating during the other window. Right? But that's one version, time-restricted eating. There's other different versions. There's modified fasting. There's whole day fasting. Whole day fasting, of course, as it sounds, it's just you fast for a whole day, and then the next day you can eat like normal. Or you fast for 2 days, and then you can eat normally for the rest of the 5 days, right? So that's there's a couple of different methods that you can use to put intermittent fasting into effect. Now, what's really cool about intermittent fasting is there are a lot of different benefits that are associated with it, right? There's increased insulin resistance whenever you're doing intermittent fasting. There's better cardiovascular health. There's some interesting studies. I know I mentioned this last time, but there's some interesting studies about the relationship between intermittent fasting, or even just broadly calorie restriction, and longevity. But I think that is still an emerging hypothesis. And of course, there is the one that most people are worried about, and that is weight loss, right? So weight loss is also something that you can achieve with intermittent fasting. Now, so that's our first point, okay? Intermittent fasting is it's a manner of dieting, right? And there's a lot of different benefits associated with it. Now, I think we run into this. It's not a problem, but I think it's something that we tend to do whenever we are on our fitness journey, and as we try and compare what are the best ways that we can do such and such a thing as a way to become more healthy. Like, what is the best weightlifting regimen? What's the best amount of times that we should be doing cardio per week? What's the optimum diet that I should be using? How much sleep should I be getting? Am I able to drink alcohol? All these different things, right? There's a bunch of different questions that people have in their minds, and they like to compare different ways or different aspects of their lifestyle so they can really optimize getting healthy, right? Now, we fall into this trap. It's not really a trap, but we fall into this trend as relates to diets as well, right? So there was an article, it came out, I remember reading this, actually, it blew my mind, but it came out like 2 or 3 years ago. And what this did is it was looking at intermittent fasting versus a bunch of other different diets. So I think it was the keto diet, just normal calorie restriction, where you're eating less than you are expending. Maybe the paleo diet was in there as well. But in any event, the main point was that there were a whole bunch of different diets that they were looked at. And this article suggested that there were no benefits to intermittent fasting over the other types of diets, right? Now, what was interesting about this is that when you look at this article, they were specifically looking at the impact on weight. So if you did intermittent fasting and you stuck with all these other diets and you compared them, there was no greater weight loss that you achieved through intermittent fasting over these other diets. And that, I think, reemphasizes the point that I mentioned a couple months ago, and that is that the most effective diet is the one that you can stick with. Like if you stick with your diet, you're going to see results, and that's awesome. So that's really good news. But the other aspect to this article, and I think that it's worth pointing out, is that it was treating health. I think it was treating health primarily as just weight loss, right? And there are so many other aspects to health than just weight loss. I think we all know this intuitively, but there's so much more to getting healthy than just losing weight. Right? And what this article seemed to be pointing at was that there's no benefit to intermittent fasting over any of these other diets just across the board. But the only thing we could say from that article is that you're not losing more weight from intermittent fasting than from any other diet. But it's totally possible that there are other benefits associated with intermittent fasting that some of these other diets don't have. Right? And so that's a really, really good question. Are there any other benefits to intermittent fasting than just the fact that you could be losing weight? Right? That's a really, really interesting question. And there's a group of researchers out at Arizona State University. Good job, Arizona State University. And what they did is they dropped a paper out a couple months ago, and they were trying to answer this question, right? They were looking at, is there a benefit to intermittent fasting over some of these other diets? And specifically, the one that they were looking at was intermittent fasting and then calorie restriction. And again, calorie restriction, all that it is that you're consuming fewer calories than you're expending. That's my understanding of the calorie restriction diet, right? So you consume a bunch of calories and then you expend a bunch of calories, but the amount that you're consuming is less than the amount that you are expending, right? That seems pretty straightforward. Now, what the folks over at Arizona State University were doing is they took a handful of men and women who are either obese or overweight, and then they divided them up, and then half of them did the intermittent fasting diet, and then half of them did the calorie restriction diet. And then what they were doing is they were trying to compare these two diets to see if there was one benefit to intermittent fasting over calorie restriction or vice versa. Now, what's really interesting about diet studies, there's a couple of different things that are interesting. The first thing is that they're really, really hard to do on people because you can't really control a person's diet. People are autonomous actors in the world, right? And so sometimes they can deviate from their diet a little bit here or there, right? And that may not be included in the overall study because they're an autonomous person living their lives, right? And it's a lot more difficult, therefore, to control the diet of a person than it is to control a mouse's diet, right? So in the case of the mouse, it's like, okay, I know exactly what the mouse is eating every single day. I know exactly every single little thing, right? So that's one difficult thing. It's hard to control for a diet when you're dealing with human beings. The other thing is that, as we mentioned a minute ago or so, is that there are a whole bunch of different aspects to diet and the influence that it has on a person, right? There's a whole bunch of different markers that you could be looking at to see, okay, it's more, one diet is more or less beneficial than the other, right? It's really, really hard. So when you're doing a study in diets, number one, you have to be you have to control for the diet as much as humanly possible, right? And number two, you have to be very, very specific about the question that you're asking. Okay, so the researchers at Arizona State University, what they were doing is they were looking at the microbiome and they were looking at the metabolome of these individuals that were doing the intermittent fasting and the calorie restricted diets. Okay, so that's point number three. The game plan was to look at the microbiome and look at the metabolome of the people to see if it shifted and if there was one benefit or if there was a benefit to one diet over the other. Okay, so after they started this diet, they ran this experiment for 8 weeks in total. And then after that 8-week period, then they looked at the individuals to see if there was one benefit to intermittent fasting over calorie restriction or vice versa. Now, what was really, really wild and really, really interesting is that the gut symptomatology of those who were doing intermittent fasting, and so those are like just the normal disease symptoms that you see in the gut. That's my understanding of symptomatology. The normal disease symptoms that you see in the gut. Overall, those symptoms looked better in the case of intermittent fasting than in the case of calorie restriction. In addition, the gut diversity of the people that did intermittent fasting was much, much better. And it also favored bacteria that did more fat processing. So when the people were doing intermittent fasting, they were enriching the diversity of their microbiome, and they were enriching it in one way by generating more bacteria that did more fat processing than the people who had the calorie restriction diet. And so what that means then, because of this change in the composition of the microbiome, this led to slightly greater fat loss, 3% more than the calorie restriction diet, in the case of the intermittent fasting individuals. So if you were doing intermittent fasting, then you lost weight, right? Like everyone else. We'll talk about that in a second. But you also had a greater fat loss because of this shift in the microbial composition of your gut. So that's really, really wild. It also encouraged a more favorable metabolic profile compared to the calorie restriction diet. And of course, as we mentioned a second ago, this was coupled with some pretty wild weight loss. And in fact, there was one individual, and this is obviously just one individual, who lost 15% of their body weight in this 8-week period time. That is wild. That is utterly wild. So I want to address a couple different things here. So first of all, our fourth point, the main point, is that intermittent fasting produced better gut microbiome. It produced a better metabolome, just overall better gut health than the calorie restriction diet, even though both of them were losing weight at presumably at the same rate. Now, again, this is just an 8-week thing, right? We don't know how it would apply across time, across months and years. And again, I want to emphasize 15% of your body weight, not everyone should be trying to or should aspire to lose 15% of your body weight. Every single person is unique in what their goals are and what they need to do and how they're trying to be healthy. And again, I want to emphasize that just this one diet, intermittent fasting, isn't the magic pill to get healthy. You could be losing a whole bunch of weight, but also have a whole bunch of other markers that indicate that you are not particularly healthy. But it is really cool to point out that using this diet, this intermittent fasting diet, seemed to have some more benefits over the calorie restriction diet. And the mechanism by which it was doing that was in part due to this restructuring and the diversification of the gut microbiome. So that's really, really cool. Really neat story. But let's wrap this up. Number one, intermittent fasting is a commonly used diet, and there's a lot of different benefits associated with intermittent fasting on the way to getting a better and more healthy lifestyle. Point number two, weight is just one dimension of a healthy lifestyle. And folks are curious to see how diets compare to each other in these areas that are distinct from weight. Point number three, researchers were looking at the microbiome and metabolome of people who were doing both the intermittent fasting diet and the calorie restriction diet to see if one was better than the other. And finally, point number four, they found that intermittent fasting produced a better gut microbiome. It produced a better metabolome than normal calorie restricted diets. Now, again, there's a whole bunch of different ways that we can tackle weight loss. Diet is one of them. Exercise is another. And again, weight loss is just one component of an overall healthy lifestyle. But it looks like we have a couple more data points to suggest that intermittent fasting is a really awesome way to do that and to become overall a more healthy individual. But that is all I have time for today. Thank you guys, every single one of you guys, for tuning in. And I hope I will see you guys again next week on another episode of Short Stories of Bacteria.